Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, America's devastating Dust Bowl of the 1930s, caused by slight changes in the surface temperature of two oceans, so finds NASA meteorologist Siegfried Schubert. We've got an excerpt from the new global warming film. No, not that one. This film is about our region.
In recent years, there's no pattern to the weather. The rain either comes too early, too late, too much, too little. The killing frost, way too early. No predictable patterns.
And the 30-second Hummer ad, if there were truth in advertising. Plus, no child left behind. Yes, student test scores are up for the 3 R's, but what about everything else, asked Claus von Zastrow, author of Academic Atrophy. We've got music by Bluesworks. Poet DJ Renegade remembers El Magnifico, Roberto Clemente. Well, Sami Miranda offers Greetings from the War. War poetry? A conversation with Sarah Browning, a leader in DC Poets Against the War. Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. Think back to 2002. 2 years of subpar rainfalls, and area officials declare a water emergency. A severe challenge for farmers, an inconvenience and aesthetic blight for the rest of us. But that's nothing compared to the drought that scorched the U.S. in the 1930s. 27 states severely hit, especially the southern Great Plains, the so-called Dust Bowl. 2 million farmers driven off their land. In 1934 alone, 35 million acres of once cultivated farmland destroyed. In 1935, 1 billion tons of topsoil blown away. It was the worst environmental catastrophe to ever hit America. Says Dr. Siegfried Schubert, it can happen again. Dr. Schubert is a meteorologist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. He's the lead author of an article in Science magazine concluding that the Dust Bowl was caused by tiny changes in the sea surface temperatures of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Welcome, Siegfried, to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
We know from El Nino that temperature changes in the Pacific Ocean can cause major changes around the world, drought in Africa, tornadoes in Florida, but what you're saying is really minuscule changes, like 0.2 of a degree change in the temperature in the Atlantic Ocean, was, along with the changes in the Pacific, the cause of the Dust Bowl?
Right. I think in order to understand the impact of the Atlantic Ocean, you really have to understand the unique features of the Great Plains. And one of those features is the existence of something called the Great Plains low-level jet. It's this stream of air that flows in from the Caribbean, comes up across and comes into the center of the continent. And that, it turns out that jet supplies most of the moisture that comes into the Great Plains. So it's the impact of the Atlantic is to divert or slightly modify that jet, and so anything that affects that jet is going to have a major impact on the climate of the United States and the Great Plains in particular.
Walk us through a little bit about how the weather pattern comes from the Atlantic over the Great Plains.
It's, as I said, it's primarily the main feature that is being impacted from the Atlantic is this sort of low-level ribbon of air that comes in from the Atlantic over the Caribbean, and then it gets diverted by the mountains of Mexico, and it flows up across Texas and Oklahoma. And that jet is perhaps a mile high. It's in the lowest kilometer of the atmosphere, but it supplies more than 30% of the water vapor coming into the continent. So it's really that phenomena that's so crucial to the precipitation in the Great Plains, and that's what affected the contributed to the Dust Bowl. But it was really this sort of double whammy. It's that plus what happened in the Pacific. So it's a combination of those two things that really caused the real devastation in the Dust Bowl.
We're in the 5th year now of a drought in the western United States. Now I know that a lot of droughts in the West are cyclic, but we're seeing increasing squabbles on the one hand between farmers and ranchers and suburbanites. There's fighting over water again. Is what you discovered about the Dust Bowl at all at issue here for the drought that we're experiencing out west now?
That's a good question. We really don't know at this point. What we do know about the Southwest drought is that it started with the La Nina, this sort of anti-El Nino, so the cool conditions over the Pacific. That seems to be really important for drought in the U.S. in general. And so those cool temperatures lasted for several years, and so that was contributing to the Southwest drought. But then in recent years, those cool temperatures have disappeared, and our models don't predict, even though that drought has continued, our models are not predicting that at this point, so we really don't know. And there's also evidence that what happens in the Great Plains is not always connected with the Southwest. So the Southwest, the climatology of that region differs very much, whereas the Great Plains had that low-level jet coming in. The Southwest is affected by the Mexican monsoon. It's much more affected by winter rains and snowfall, so what happens in the other seasons is just as important. So
how about here on the Atlantic coast?
The Atlantic coast, it's actually rather unusual. Typically, when we think of the Atlantic coast, it's sort of a wet region. You don't really think about droughts occurring in the Atlantic. And it's really only in the 60s where we had one of the most devastating droughts in recent times, and then again in 1999. And there's evidence, again, that that drought is also related to sea surface temperature changes. There was actually a study recently that suggested it was this combination, again, of cool Eastern Pacific, but warmer Indian Ocean and Western Pacific temperatures that contributed to that drought.
Now, your study focuses on sea surface temperature changes in tropical areas, which are considerably south of even the southern Great Plains. Wouldn't it have a greater impact if the sea surface temperature change anomalies were at the same latitude as the mainland U.S.?
Actually, no. That's a very good question. But
well,
really, it's really, it turns out the tropics is where the atmosphere is much more sensitive to sea surface temperatures because it's wet, it's very unstable. You need a very much smaller change in surface temperatures to generate precipitation and to affect the atmosphere. So, but that's really a critical
Tell me about
point.
the reliability of your computer model. I know that you believe that the 1970s should have been a repeat of the Dust Bowl, I think, based upon what you were reading about sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So how reliable is the model you're working with?
It's actually, I think one thing you have to understand is the climate system is chaotic. It's stochastic. So if you look,
what?
Chaotic,
Okay.
It has a random component to it.
Okay.
So when we ran those experiments, we didn't run just one. We actually ran 14 different experiments covering the 100 years. And so we get a range, we get some idea of how much the sea surface temperatures really control the climate over the U.S. And if you get the very tight packing of those runs, it suggests it's really the oceans that's doing the forcing. But if they're spread apart, that suggests things are largely unpredictable. And so in the 70s, we have the case where the model predicts a fairly large range. So a few of those members actually looked very much like the observations. So the question is, were we just unlucky at that time? That whereas we really probably should have been in a drought sort of from a chance or probabilistic point of view. But we just got lucky in one of those members. It was more like observations.
How applicable is your model to other drought-stricken areas like the Sahel?
Actually, very applicable. There's actually another study that was done not too long ago that used the same model to look at the Sahel drought. And the model also reproduced that drying that occurred during the 60s and 70s. In that case, it was again tied to sea surface temperatures, but the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean played a key role.
So how likely are we to see another Dust Bowl in the southern Great Plains in the country as a whole?
I think it's very likely. I think if you don't have, all you have to do is look at the historical record, the paleo record. These sort of droughts occur roughly once or twice. These mega droughts occur roughly once or twice a century. So just from that alone, you have to believe we're almost certainly going to have one of those droughts again. But of course, we've had warming in the last 20, 30 years. The oceans have warmed quite a bit. It's sort of a very unique situation. And so we have El Nino on top of that. And so what's going to happen is really not clear.
So we know this.
Mm-hmm.
Can't do anything about the weather, right? What does it matter that we know it?
Well, the hope is that potentially we can make predictions. Right now, we're really not at that stage. Our study really said, given the sea surface temperature, if we knew the sea surface temperatures, this is how the atmosphere will respond. This is what will happen. And so that's sort of a big step. That's sort of we haven't really been able to do that before. Our models are now getting good enough that, because one of the interesting things about the Great Plains also is the interaction with the land surface. That was also a crucial part of that study, that it was once things dried out, the land got dry, less evaporation, and so it fed back and it really intensified the drought. So these sort of physical mechanisms, now the models are getting good enough to do that. But ultimately, to predict, we have to have the fully coupled system with the ocean and the atmosphere and the land all working together. And we can do that now with El Nino, but on these very long time scales, we're not there yet.
You said before that the ocean temperatures are warming up. But with global warming, we're seeing the melting of the glaciers, the polar ice caps. Some people speculate that there will be a flow down the Atlantic of the ice that will cool the Atlantic. Spin out for us various scenarios of how planetary warming might interact with the model that you're developing.
Of course, I haven't been focused on global warming research, but I think the crucial thing really is that, so the lesson we've learned from our study is that these small sea surface temperatures, the details of the sea surface temperatures matter. So what happens in the Atlantic or Pacific is very critical to climate all over the globe, and it's these very small changes. So we haven't really gotten to the stage where we're really looking at sort of scenarios of global warming and how that might affect the sea surface temperatures, but that's certainly a step we want to proceed on.
And what else do you want to look at this point? What are the other implications of your study?
I think one of the things we'd like to do is, right now the runs we've made have been with very coarse resolution models. So we don't really resolve in detail the weather systems, hurricanes. It turns out during the 30s there was a very active hurricane season, but they were all diverted and hit Mexico or went up the East Coast, and none of them went up into the Great Plains. And we don't resolve that phenomena. So we'd like to reproduce some of these runs with much higher resolution to get more at these sort of regional phenomena and look at weather extremes as well.
Okay, great. Many thanks to Goddard's Dr. Siegfried Schubert for his important work on the human impacts caused by changes in climate. Global warming is now, of course, the subject of a Hollywood blockbuster, The Day After Tomorrow. It should go without saying that Hollywood would never let scruples over scientific accuracy get in the way of a great disaster movie, or even a bad one with great special effects. The Day After Tomorrow may be lame, but that doesn't mean we aren't facing a crisis. Consider the view of England's chief scientist, Sir David King, who warns that if global warming remains unchecked, the only habitable continent on Earth by century's end will be Antarctica. And we'll feel the effects of climate change long before then. In fact, a new documentary film, one I had a hand in, finds that the effects of climate change are evident even now, right here in our region.
The region in recent years, affecting our economy and health. Sea level rise is eroding shores everywhere, and the generally strange, unstable weather has affected farming.
When I first started farming 30 years ago, everything went according to script. In recent years, there's no pattern to the weather. The rain either comes too early, too late, too much, too little. The killing frost, way too early. No predictable patterns.
The World Meteorological Organization in July 2003 documented a pattern of sharply erratic weather worldwide in recent years and linked it to global warming. Meanwhile, landmark reports from the Bush administration have further detailed the evidence of global warming while confirming the strong certainty that fossil fuel use is driving most of it. Among other impacts, the Bush administration projects that places like Assateague and Chincoteague Islands may largely disappear due to sea level rise, and that the Colorado River, providing drinking water to Los Angeles, may dry up completely due to diminished snowfall in the Rockies. Yet the Bush administration, dominated by former oil and automaker executives, asserts that switching to clean, renewable energy will disrupt the U.S. economy. Standing virtually alone in the world, the administration rejected the International Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The administration also cites what it calls lingering uncertainty in climate science. As a result, official U.S. policy is to burn substantially more, not less, fossil fuels, and to heavily subsidize this industry with tens of billions of taxpayer dollars. The White House has asked U.S. businesses to voluntarily cut their greenhouse gas emissions, but few companies have come forward.
While there are some scientific uncertainties, what we do know is that the Earth has warmed, precipitation patterns have changed, and sea level has risen. In addition, we project a much warmer world in the future, more floods, more droughts, and these will have overwhelmingly negative impacts on agriculture, human health, water resources, and the displacement of many, many people.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the Coffee House. There is a new federal law with a catchy title, No Child Left Behind, that is meant to narrow the performance gap in our public schools between children of affluence and children of poverty. Hard to quarrel with such good intentions. But that law, like most federal laws, is also subject to the law of unintended consequences. What is the actual effect of No Child Left Behind? What is actually happening in the schools attended by children of low-income families, especially minority students? The Council for Basic Education recently undertook an investigation, and the author of that study, Claus von Zastrow, is here with us. Welcome, Claus.
Thank you.
Okay, that law was passed about a couple years ago. Congress did the thing, and a lot of eloquent, grandiose talk about well-rounded education for everyone. But in essence, it comes down to a set of standardized tests, right?
Well, standardized tests are certainly a big part of it.
Okay.
The law is very complex. There are very few people understanding all of its details,
right.
like a lot of federal laws. But if I were to try to break down some of the basic principles of the law, first of all, there is the principle of accountability. And the idea is that schools will be held accountable for the performance of their students. And they've been very careful to say they have to be held accountable for the performance of all different types of students. The fear was that even in wealthy schools that do very well in the aggregate, that certain groups of students, usually students of poverty or students of color, aren't doing as well, and so they were perpetuating old gaps. So the way you measure student performance, of course, tends to be standardized tests.
Through tests. And there's a punishment for failure.
And there's a punishment for failure. If schools do not meet something called adequate yearly progress, there's a rather complicated statistical formula for determining how far each school must move each subset of students in any given year, then they are subject to different sanctions. Those sanctions over time can even include school reorganization. Over the short run, however, they can get more help to try to push the scores up.
So there's a huge incentive to pass the test and presumably do better.
Yes.
But there's an inherent flaw in the legislation, I gather from your study, that the focus is too narrow.
Well, our concern is that by focusing these accountability measures entirely on mathematics and reading, and eventually they're going to build science into that as well, they're going to create an incentive for schools to ignore all the other subjects.
And what's left out? Civics, government?
Exactly. I mean, civics, history, foreign language, the arts, for example. geography. These are all areas that we're very concerned about.
Right. So you've actually looked at this and discovered that that theory of yours, in fact, is what's happening in schools.
To a large degree. What we decided to do was ask principals. We figured principals are probably one of the easiest points of contact where we can get a sense of what's going on in any given school. So we surveyed 1,000 principals in 4 different states, including Maryland. It was Maryland, New York, Illinois, and New Mexico. We also had focus groups of principals from all around the country to try to get a sense of context of what was going on. Well, in our survey, well, we found a couple of things. We found that there was a good deal of evidence of curricular erosion in areas such as the arts, not too surprisingly, history, civics, and geography on the elementary level, and foreign language.
So essentially what's happening is that teachers are teaching to the test, they're focusing on math and reading, and I guess eventually science will be next, but to the exclusion or to the detriment of teaching the other subjects.
That's our fear. Now, people can argue with some justification that there are a lot of students out there who do not read and do mathematics adequately. And so a lot of people say you have to read to learn. Our argument is that is true. However, we have to have a long-term program for making sure that all kids get the richer education that we think everyone needs in this
As you say, all kids. And what pops out in your study is that it's the kids who were presumably to be the beneficiaries of this law who are most severely affected by this kind of biased teaching now, namely minority students.
Yeah, we found that it was the schools that had large minority populations that were most likely to show erosion in areas such as the arts, foreign language, and history at the elementary level. That might stand to reason. A lot of people will argue, for example, that there are historical gaps in achievement between minority students and non-minority students. And they found that these gaps are motivating principals in schools with mostly minority students to focus on those basics, on reading and math, and then to draw attention and resources away from other areas.
Okay, so if I'm the parent of a student who's in a substandard school trying to catch up, what do you say to me? I say I want my kid to learn to read and do arithmetic. What's the point of learning Spanish or American history or whatever if I have to make a choice?
Well, I would say a couple of things. To begin with, I would say if I were the kind of principal we like to see, and I have seen quite a few of these principals, quite a few heroes out there, I would say if you want your child to learn to read better, that child's going to have to learn to read about something. There's a lot of evidence that shows that students who are given that pure focus on reading without any interest in the other content areas, they peak at 4th grade. But once they have to read intermediate and even advanced texts that assume prior knowledge, they assume context, they assume children's exposure to a richer set of cultural artifacts, then their scores at reading will drop off dramatically, and they'll be left way behind their peers.
So in effect, it's almost rote reading that they're learning.
It can be. I mean, I don't want to be unfair to the people who teach this sort of basic reading. There are things called phonics and other types of reading instruction that are very important and that are very effective. We just argue that those kinds of reading then should be coupled with reading in the content areas, exposure to all of these other kinds of disciplinary areas that are so important to being human and also important to existing in this new world where we have conflict in other countries and we have to understand other nations and other histories and things of that nature.
Yeah, so we have to know who to vote for and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, is it because these children are so far behind, or is it because there is such fear of failing the tests that it's such a rigid approach?
Well, it could be a number of things. I mean, in defense of the policymakers who put this law together, it really is important, they've discovered, to make sure that every subgroup of kids is getting attention. The real danger is that a lot of groups became invisible. They became invisible in greater swaths of data. So you thought, we're doing well, we're seeing improvement, but minority kids, kids in high poverty schools, were actually being left behind, to borrow the lost phraseology. Well, at a certain point, we have to make sure we're focusing on what's happening to those kids. And so that led to the development of rather rigid structures, that schools were labeled in need of improvement if one subgroup wasn't doing well. There are problems with that. There are statistical problems. Not every school will make the kind of progress every year that they would like to see. On the other hand, the intent of the law really is an intent to establish equity. We're arguing that equity has to be more broadly conceived in the long term.
Right, so there should be some flexibility and laxness in the approach, so you can incorporate a truly well-rounded approach.
Yes, or at the very least, there has to be a long-term plan for creating this truly well-rounded approach. We have to have a vision of education that incorporates all of the subject areas, all of the disciplines. Otherwise, it really will be an impoverished vision that we aim for.
So you need a curriculum from grades K through, well, 12 or so, if we're talking about the public schools, I guess, that really step by step begins to include a larger focus.
Yeah, and we also need things like the arts that engage a lot of kids in different ways, kids who don't learn in the conventional ways. Once they're deprived of these kinds of experiences, they can really shut down and not accept the schooling that they would have accepted in other circumstances.
So is the law, can we work with the law as it exists, or do we need to reform the law? Or I mean, is there enough flexibility out there at the local level?
Well, I mean, we could say in the best of all possible worlds that No Child Left Behind gives schools flexibility in how they should do things. So you can find examples of schools that are doing what we would consider to be the right thing, even under the current mandates. However, human nature being what it is, the pressures of being a principal, quite frankly, being what they are, it's very difficult to do that. If you have to make adequate yearly progress every year, where are you going to focus your attention? So there might be some ways of either loosening up the law a bit to allow principals to become more encompassing in their approach earlier on, or establishing long-term targets for getting all of the kids the richest exposure to the kind of education they all really should be receiving.
Right, so instead of year to year, I mean, to give a 5-year progress report or even longer,
something
I guess.
Like that, certainly, and not in such a way as to allow backsliding. Right. I mean, it is true that a lot of children have been underserved for various reasons. We also believe they need resources. Schools will need resources in order to assess children the best possible way. Lousy tests aren't going to help.
Right, yeah, and of course, that's a whole other part of the law, the fact that it's underfunded pretty much across the board. But, well, quickly, we're going to run out of time. Are there any other solutions, suggestions, and so forth that you want to throw out at us?
Well, I would say most generally, teach reading and math in context. They only have value in their context, in their historical context, their social context, their economic context, etc. It will enrich the student's experience over the long term. We would also say then teach teachers, even in the content areas in high school and middle school, to teach reading. A lot of students do not know how to read at the high school level. They need this exposure.
Yes, it's a life
a lifelong skill.
Lifelong skill, right? Exactly. And what do you do next? Will there be a follow-up to this study?
Well, we're trying to do the study in different states. We're also, quite frankly, trying to focus more attention on the actual quality of what's going on in particular classrooms. What we did was a very broad view. We wanted to present a view of what was going on in global terms, how much time is being devoted to each subject. Now we want to go into things like the quality of writing instruction, the quality of teacher preparation for these subject areas, things that will really give us a richer sense of what's going on in American schools.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that your investigations and following through on this are really critical, because it's a big law with a big mandate and and a big purpose, but will it work?
Yeah, well, we'll give it time.
Yeah. Right. Thanks to Claus von Zastrow for the excellent analysis of the No Child Left Behind law. When it comes to public schools, there seems to be a few basic lessons still unlearned by our lawmakers in Washington. One size fits all doesn't work. Quick fixes often backfire. Solutions are hard to come by. My own opinion? Well, it's too bad we don't have more school teachers in political offices. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
Who am I? I am a small point in the eye of the full moon. I need only one ray of the sun to warm my face. I need only one breeze from the trade winds to refresh my soul. What else can I ask if I know that my sons really love me? Roberto Clemente. I awoke under a heavy quilt to a distant crackling radio. My lips smiled as I realized it was New Year's Day. I rolled over, strained to hear the broadcast above my brother Jeff snoring in the bunk below. The regular program had been interrupted. There was the sound of waves washing against the shore, which I soon realized was my mother crying. It was January in Pittsburgh, which is to say the radiator struggled against the chill howling outside our cracked window. I hopped down onto frozen linoleum, tiptoed to my mother's bedroom door. The newscaster reported that a plane carrying Roberto Clemente and food and clothing for earthquake victims in Nicaragua had crashed off the coast of Florida. The word struck my chest like the fat end of a baseball bat. It had never occurred to me that a hero could die. A glove left in the grass at the Little League field was all I knew of loss. In a world of cracked asphalt and chipped bricks, his John Henry swagger was all I knew of myth. A skinny 10-year-old, I fell asleep pretending he was my father, even though a stadium shouting, "Arriba, Roberto," was all I knew of Spanish. I'd taken a black crayon and drawn the number 21 on the back of a T-shirt, then fought to play right field, because his glove upturned for a basket catch was all I knew of grace. Brown as spiced rum, black as a barge of coal, he spanned the gap from Puerto Rico's cane fields to Pittsburgh's Three Rivers. Dark smoke choked the sun. Our city of rusty bridges and steep hills lost the glow from its fabled mills. While on the Florida shore, his family sang as the waves peaked like shark's teeth and the arms of the palm trees waved, "Arriba, Roberto, adios."
I've got those keys, well, to the highway. Build out, I'm bound to go. I'm gonna leave here running, 'cause walking was too slow. When the moon peeps over a mountain, and I be on my way, I got to roam this highway till the break of day. going back down to the border where I am better known. Well, you ain't done nothing, baby, but drove a good man away from home. That's why I've got those keys, yes, to the highway. Build out and I'm bound to go. I'm gonna leave here running, y'all, 'cause walking more's too slow.
Ease to the highway. Welcome.
East Highway.
Welcome,
Hey,
Paul.
David, how are
Welcome,
you?
Judy. Welcome to the coffee house.
All right.
Thank you, David.
I guess if you were writing that today, it would be the GPS system to the highway.
That's right. I guess
With a
it
map
would be.
quest. So, how long has Bluesworks been together?
Oh, let's see. We did the CD 2 years ago, and we were together about 10 years. So it's about close to 13 by now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we were talking before we started, you said actually you were both in other groups, other duos, but not together.
Right.
And that,
And not just in duos. Yeah, actually, mostly in duos. I played with a South African woman, and actually we had a Ghanaian drummer work with us sometimes. I work with Eleanor Ellis in a blues duo.
Right.
And Paul...
I work with a guy called Mike Roach, plays guitar. He's over in England now. I believe he's full-time, and he runs a camp over there, too, and everything.
good.
But we did lots of kinds of clubs and that
Now,
kind of thing.
Do you think of yourselves more in the acoustic sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, but even though our instrumentation sometimes is somewhat electric, but I mean, if we had a piano, it would be acoustic. That would be the only thing. And besides hearing ourselves,
Right.
but our style, I think it's more towards the style and the tendency to what we like. We like more of the acoustic, older musicians, a lot of their stuff, and they were just basically, just acoustic. I'm trying to stay true to it.
Who do you listen to when you say source material? I want to go back and listen.
Well, Otis Spann is my number one piano player, but Julia Lee is another piano player. Someone who's alive and well out on the West Coast is Miss Jeannie Cheatham. I love Nina Simone. There's just a whole bunch of people. Leroy Carr, of course, and there was another guy who was related to Otis Spann. Oh, Jones. Remember
Johnny
him?
Jones.
Johnny
Johnny
Jones,
Jones,
yeah.
And when you're doing gigs, if you do 50 dates, how many are in the Washington, D.C. area, and how many are out of town? That's a long way of saying, are you on the
Very
road a
few
lot?
in town.
Most are out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
We'd like to do more in town, but we
Okay.
don't.
If you hear that out there, folks, contact the station.
We'd like to do more paying gigs in town.
Well, yes, we were assuming that. Well, how about you take us out with one more?
Sure.
What's it called?
Chuck It.
Okay, I'll step back and listen.
I've done this tune a million times, but I like to have my words in front of me just in case my mind goes somewhere else. That's the beauty of being a piano player.
Your
You
mind
have
is
a place,
somewhere else.
you have a place to lay your words. All right. 1, 2. When trouble troubles you, don't worry, don't be blue, just chuck it. Chuck it in a bucket. Oh, chuck it in the deep blue sea. When bills are piling high, don't worry, don't cry, just chuck it. Chuck it in a bucket. Oh, yeah. Chuck it in the deep blue sea. So go on and have your fun. You won't live as long, you won't go as far. Life is just a loaded cigar. You're not married to a movie star, so chuck it in a bucket. I'll chuck it in the deep blue sea. When old man Gloom comes by, just give him the evil eye and chuck him. Chuck him and duck him, let's duck him. I'll chuck him in the deep blue sea. Though the good times won't seem to roll, an empty bed and an empty bowl. Got your rod, got your fishing pole, always got your jelly roll. So chuck it, oh boy, chuck it in a bucket. Oh, chuck it in the deep blue sea. Oh, chuck it. Look at the side that's bright when they turn out your light and chuck it in a bucket. Chuck it in the deep blue sea. Go on and chuck it in the deep blue sea. Oh, you know what to do. Chuck it in the deep blue sea.
I will greet you with flowers no matter how many bullets you bring. I will greet you with bullets because the flowers you greet me with are from my garden. I will greet you with song though you curse me and raise arms against me. I will greet you with curses because the wounded child at your feet is my only son. I will greet you with embraces though the knife you carry cuts away at my arms. I will greet you with knives. They are made from the shrapnel I pulled from my leg.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Our guest is a poet whose work is respected and enjoyed both inside and beyond the Beltway. In addition to producing her own infectious, insightful work, she's taken on the equally daunting task of editing a recent anthology of poems concerned with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Her name's Sarah Browning. Welcome, Sarah, to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Reuben. It's great to be here.
Sure, have a latte here. Let's just talk a few minutes about this anthology. I think before we get into the logistics, could you actually start by reading something from the collection for us, please?
Sure.
Great.
I think I'll start by reading the first poem in the book. It's by a poet named Ann Knox, who's a longtime Washington resident. And it was written, she read it in front of the White House on February 12th, 2003, which was the first day of National Day of Poetry Against the War. And there were readings nationwide, and I organized one in the district that evening as well. And that sort of started the group that put out the anthology. It's called This Moment, read in front of the White House, February 12, 2003. We meet in this wind-harsh square with some expectation, some hope our presence will count, our voices be heard. We speak from what we know, and we know no poem stirs from a closed mind. Has the mailed fist so closed on its own purpose, we speak to stone? Pay attention. Our words matter. These bare trees matter. The Potomac flowing black under white ice matters. Kids, woods, a leashed dog, poems matter. All our lives converge on this moment and what follows tonight, tomorrow, next week will change our whole desperate earth.
Wow, amazing. Who was that again now?
Anne B. Knox.
Anne Knox, yeah. One of our many, I'd say, DC area lights, poetically speaking.
Yes.
I'm tempted because of the strength of that poem to kind of lurch into a conversation about choosing work, but I'll hold off. We talked about this earlier because I wanted the audience to learn something about your involvement. How did you get involved with this anthology? Did they pick you out of the lineup of great poets, or?
Yeah,
of course
right.
they did. That is true.
The big
of course,
they.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They.
I had started bringing poets together to read our work that was speaking for peace, because there was a national movement to organize poetry readings against the war, really inspired by the poet Sam Hamill on the West Coast, who had been invited to the White House to celebrate the poetry of Emily Dickinson, Langston Hughes, and Walt Whitman. And the event was supposed to be on February 12th. And Hamill is a Buddhist and a pacifist, and he chose not to go to the White House at the time that this administration was beating the drum for war. And he put the word out to about 50 of his poet friends to send him anti-war poems, and he said he would get them to the First Lady. Well, of course, he got not 50 poems, but 1,000, 2,000,
sure.
Eventually 14,000 poems came into Poets Against the War, and they established a website and published all the poems on the site, and that's at poetsagainstthewar.org. And he called on poets to make that day a day of poetry readings against the war. So I had just arrived in DC about 4 or 5 months earlier, and I started looking for a reading that night. I assumed in the district there'd be a reading. And I found out later there was this one in front of the White House the day of, but it was small and it was freezing, and it was not a place where all poets could come together.
Sure.
So about a week before the date, I decided that I would try to organize something. And so I got All Souls Unitarian Church in Columbia Heights. They agreed to host it, and I put out the word as best I could, not knowing a single poet in Washington, and 200 people came.
Amazing.
And 60 signed up to read. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life, that there was this powerful need of poets to speak, and to speak through the medium that they use, which is poetry. And of course, we only had time for 30 to read. So immediately, we had a movement, because there were those 30 folks who didn't get to read. So we had people organizing, and we had a second event. And then once the invasion began in March.
March, right, okay.
We started reading in small groups in public places as kind of witnessing and just taking it out into the streets. So we were outside metro stations and in parks, on the National Mall during cherry blossom season. And one of Danny Rose, who was a poet active in the group, suggested we do an anthology. He was friends with Ron Baker, who is the editor, publisher of Argonne House Press, which publishes Word Rights, which is a journal, local journal. And so I said, what a great idea. So we got together, and I recruited also Naomi Ayala and Michelle Elliott, and the four of us, Danny, Naomi, Michelle, and I, put out the word to the wider literary community, as well as to the poets who'd been active in the group, that we were looking for work for the anthology. And we received over 300 poems. And we did that just kind of through email lists and word of mouth, and as many, of those kinds of contacts as we could, because, and it was a very moving, overwhelming outpouring of work, all kinds of poetry from all kinds of poets. And that was always true from the beginning, from the very first event. We had avant-garde poets, spoken word poets, new formalists, people writing in form, poets like me, narrative, sort of lyrical poets. And we had folks too who'd never really written before, but they found poetry to be the most powerful medium for them at that moment. And we had poets who had 5 books, and poets just starting out, and everybody in between. So when we put the book together, we were very conscious of trying to represent that variety and that diversity. And also the variety of poets themselves, Latino poets, African American poets, Arab American poets, gay and lesbian poets, young people. There are 2 10-year-olds in the book. There's some teenagers, and there's an 80-year-old, and there are folks everywhere in between. So
it's a great array of people.
We worked very hard at trying to collect those voices and have the book be representative of the great variety of poets who were writing and using poetry as a means to protest the war or to oppose it before it began.
Sure. Well, let me kind of tag on to something else you said earlier. I want to go back to the readings you've done around the city. What was the response to those readings? I know I've had the pleasure of doing those in the past, and you get everything from kind of curious gazes to, are these people, are they certifiable or what have you? But what was it? What was that experience like?
It was quite amazing. We did have very occasionally somebody would say, we had somebody say, "You're 40 years too late," as if there's some statute of limitations on dissent.
Oh,
yes.
Sure, of course. We're your bell-bottoms, kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for the most part, people either ignored us completely or stopped and listened. And one guy, when we were out it started to snow, because you remember last winter it snowed into April.
A real winter, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He stayed the whole time. We were out for about an hour and a half, and he went and got us coffee. He didn't ask. He just went and got coffee and brought it back and gave us all coffee, and then stood back and listened to more poetry.
My gosh.
Spontaneously. When we were on the mall, it was cherry blossom season, so it was mobbed with tourists from all over the world, which was fascinating. And a lot of people stopped and listened, and some came and stood next to us to have their pictures taken with us, which I thought was part of their travel log. Here we are at the Lincoln Memorial.
Yes.
Here we are with the Poets Against the War.
Dissenting iambic Americans. Could you actually read another poem? I know you chose something of your own, I think, from the anthology as well. Thank you.
My poem is called Sunday Morning, Spring, and I actually wrote it during the war in Afghanistan 2 years ago. And I wrote it after the United States had bombed a wedding party, accidentally. But it was an entire wedding party. And of course that happened again recently in Iraq.
Absolutely,
so
sure.
Unfortunately this poem continues to be relevant.
Resonate.
Yeah. Sunday morning, spring. We eat and the world watches. An angry flag whips the air, the wind of a bomb singing through the desert. Who wants to know the landing? It is the singing we want, the standing and the singing. I am telling you, look, do not turn the page. Tear out the bikini ad, burn it. Those women's bodies might find their twins floating in the light above the desert.
You know, I think that my bias for poetry notwithstanding, I think you've done a wonderful job here of capturing the variety of talent here in this area, and I think the possibilities inherent within poetry to discuss whether it's war or the hope for peace as well. So I congratulate you for that, and I'm certainly glad you were able to come and give us at least a taste of this wonderful anthology. So,
thank you.
So thank you, and I wish we could go on and on, as poets tend to do. So,
exactly.
but thank you. Many thanks to Sarah Browning for joining us in the Coffee House to discuss the anthology DC Poets Against the War. I'm Reuben Jackson, and this has been Writer's Block.